The Republican whip.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be rescinded.
Without objection.
Mr. President, during the first few years after it became the law, the Affordable Care Act was known to most Americans as mainly a set of promises. Americans were repeatedly told that Obamacare once it began to take full effect, that coverage would expand, premiums would go down, and everyone who liked their existing health care coverage could keep it. When the President and my friends across the aisle described it this way, Obamacare sounded too good to be true. Unfortunately, the promises really turned out to be too good to be true. After spending years listening to hollow assurances about what Obamacare would or would not do, the past 5 weeks have taught us a lot, maybe just the tip of the iceberg, about what the realities of Obamacare actually look like. Well, we've learned that no fewer than 3.5 million, 3.5 million Americans have already received cancellation notices from their insurance coverage because of the new law. We've learned that millions more will receive those same type of notices in the foreseeable future. And we've learned that the administration, and in fact the Senate, knew that was going to happen in 2010 because we had a vote on a Congressional Review Act of the regulation which would have expanded the grandfather clause, and it was defeated in a party line vote, with all Republicans voting to expand the grandfathering provision and all our Democratic colleagues voting against. Well, we learned that when they launched the Obamacare website, which has been perhaps the most visible image of Obamacare, but they did it before they could guarantee that the information you put in it would be secure. That includes both your tax information, your Social Security, your health, mental health, and physical health conditions. And we've learned that yesterday, Secretary Sebelius confirmed that the navigators, which are the people who've been hired to help people navigate the Affordable Care Act and just signed up, that they were hired without performing any kind of background check. And yesterday, to the surprise of a lot of people, Secretary Sebelius answered a very direct question about that. When I asked her in the Finance Committee, I said, is it possible that a person could be a navigator and be a convicted felon? And she said, it's possible, because there is no criminal background check. In other words, America's top health care officials believe it's possible that convicted felons could be collecting some of your most sensitive personal information, your Social Security number, your tax information, and sensitive medical data. And yet, this administration continues to insist upon refusing a proper vetting system. Now, it's bad enough that the website is entirely dysfunctional, but that's going to get fixed sooner or later. But the fact is that this same website could, in the interim, become a magnet for fraud and identity theft. Now, many of us who were skeptics about the President's extravagant promises of Obamacare once implemented, we've been expressing our concerns for years about Obamacare. But I have to tell you, as skeptical as I was about Obamacare when it passed the Senate on Christmas Eve in 2009, it's even worse than many of us predicted, certainly worse than we imagined. With millions of Americans getting cancellation notices from their insurance companies, we're finding out that their premiums are about to go up and not go down. It's important to remember exactly why this is happening. Well, thanks to the regulations of our friends across the aisle continue to support, Obamacare has allowed Washington bureaucrats to define what constitutes an acceptable health insurance policy in the individual and the small group market. In other words, it's allowed Washington bureaucrats to force hardworking American families to pay for health care coverage they don't want and they don't need. I've heard from my constituents in Texas who are absolutely furious and in some cases absolutely desperate about losing their coverage or being forced to pay higher premiums that they simply can't afford in order to buy coverage that they don't need. Now, the underlying conceit of Obamacare is that individuals and their families can't be trusted to choose the right health insurance plans for themselves, so you got to turn it over to the bureaucracy in Washington to do it for them. Well, some have heard us talk about a government takeover of the health care system. That's what a government takeover of the health care system looks like. When you lose the choices that should be available to you as an American citizen to make your own health care choices about what kind of policies you need at a price you can afford, and you no longer can do it because of this monstrosity of a law. That's a government takeover. The main objective of Obamacare, we were told, is to provide coverage for all Americans. And yet the Congressional Budget Office has made it clear that Obamacare fails even in that objective. They estimate about 30 million people will still remain uncovered by the year 2023 when Obamacare has been fully implemented. 30 million people. So okay, explain to me again, what was the purpose of this exercise? We were going to bring costs down and cover people without insurance, and you'd be able to keep what you had if you liked it, and none of that ends up being true. All of that ends up being false. As I said yesterday, the costs of Obamacare far outweigh the benefits. It would have been a lot smarter for us to figure out how do you deal with the people who are uninsured and get them insured without raising costs or prejudicing the rights of people who had policies they already liked. Well, if Congress were to choose at some point to actually dismantle Obamacare in its entirety, which I think we ought to do, we ought to start over and enact an alternative health care reform legislation aimed at solving the problem, not creating new ones. These reforms could include revising the tax code so that individuals could buy their own health insurance on the same tax terms if it's employer provided. We would allow people to actually buy in the health care market nationally and form pools to share risks. That would help bring down the costs. It would increase competition. We also ought to expand the use of tax-free health savings accounts so people could decide, I want to buy a high-deductible catastrophic health insurance policy because it's pretty cheap. In the meantime, I want to set money aside each month in a health savings account, and maybe I'll need it for health care, maybe I won't. But I get to do it tax-free, and if I don't use it, I'll be able to use that as part of my retirement. We ought to expand that. And we ought to make health care price and quality information a lot more transparent. One of the most successful health care programs that I've seen pass the Congress, we made some mistakes with it. We should have offset the cost of the prescription drug plan, Medicare Part D, but it actually has worked better than any of us thought it would because it's not a government takeover, but it created a competition between competing prescription drug companies who had to compete based on quality and price. The result is the price has gone down roughly 30% under projected costs when it was passed. That's the kind of transparency and choices that are produced from quality information that leaves the choices in people individually and not gives them to government. And yes, we ought to crack down on frivolous medical malpractice lawsuits. We've seen in Texas that reducing the costs of frivolous medical malpractice lawsuits in turn helps protect against defensive medicine, where doctors make decisions, clinical decisions, based not on their best judgment, medical judgment, but based on their aversion to litigation risks. And we ought to use high-risk pools to ensure that people with pre-existing conditions can get covered. This is one of the biggest misrepresentations I've heard about Obamacare. Some of our colleagues have said, well, the only way you can get pre-existing conditions covered is to take Obamacare hook, line, and sinker. Well, that's clearly not true. Virtually all of our states have high-risk programs for people with pre-existing conditions. They may need to be better funded, and we ought to look to try to shore them up, but not to create more problems rather than fixing the problems that we know exist. And we ought to give the states more flexibility to deal with Medicaid. Now, Medicaid is designed as a safety net program for people who can't afford to buy their own health insurance. But I know the senator from Maine is very intimately involved in this when she was at the state level and the insurance commissioner there. But Medicaid, unfortunately, pays doctors about half of what private health insurance does to reimburse them for their costs. So many doctors have to restrict their practice and their ability to see new Medicaid patients. In Texas, only about a third of doctors will see a new Medicaid patient because they simply can't afford to do so. So we need to have additional freedom to improve Medicaid and to shore it up while providing competition and consumer choice to bring down costs in Medicare. Mr. President, such reforms would give us a health care system with much lower costs, much better coverage, and much greater access to quality care. Those are the sorts of reforms we should have embraced in 2009 and 10, but did not. We missed our chance back then, but there's no good reason we have to accept Obamacare or nothing. Matter of fact, we should take this opportunity as we see the promises of Obamacare being broken and not living up to the expectations of its strongest proponents. We ought to turn to these other sensible ways to lower costs, increase coverage, and improve access. As the law's deficiencies become more and more evident, I hope my friends across the aisle will join with us, Republicans and Democrats alike, to replace Obamacare with something better. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maine.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, we are about to make history in this chamber by passing the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, more commonly known as ENDA. We will establish the principle that the right to work free from discrimination is a fundamental right of each and every American, regardless of age, race, gender, religion, disability, national origin, and now, finally, sexual orientation. It has taken a long time to get to this day. More than 10 years ago, I was proud to join a lifelong champion of civil rights, the late Senator Ted Kennedy, as a co-sponsor of ENDA. That was back in 2002. Over the years, our country has rightly taken a stand against workplace discrimination in a wide variety of forms. It is past time that we close this gap for our LGBT employees. Mr. President, the time to pass this bill has come. I want to thank Senators Merkley and Kirk for taking up the cause and for moving this bill forward. Senator Kirk, along with Senators Hatch and Murkowski, led Republican support for this bill during its consideration by the Health Committee. I also want to acknowledge the work of the chairman of the committee, Tom Harkin, in bringing this bill to the floor. Other senators who helped to improve this bill include Senators Portman, Ayotte, Heller, Hatch, and McCain in their effort to draft strong anti-retaliation language. Their amendment, which was adopted unanimously, improves this bill by strengthening the protections for religious institutions that are legitimately exempted under ENDA. And I would like to thank each of those senators and others, such as Senator Flake, for their willingness to work with the sponsors and co-sponsors of this legislation. Senator Toomey also has worked hard. Mr. President, All Americans deserve a fair opportunity to pursue the American dream. ENDA is simply about the fundamental right to work and to be judged according to one's abilities, qualifications, and job performance. Much of corporate America has already voluntarily embraced LGBT protections because they know that doing so helps them attract and retain the best and the brightest employees. Nearly 24 states have versions of ENDA. In fact, in my home state of Maine, it has been the law for nearly a decade. Simply put, Mr. President, ENDA is about fairness and workplace equality. Today, I am confident that the Senate will affirm that principle and will say to everyone in this country that the workplace is simply no place for discrimination. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President,
Senator from Oregon.
I ask unanimous consent for 5 minutes to speak to this bill.
Is there objection? So ordered.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank my colleague who preceded me, who has summarized the substantial bipartisan collaboration that took place to bring this bill to this point, this bill that we will be voting on in just a few minutes, and no one has done more than she has done to advance this conversation over many, many years. And I thank the Senator from Maine for those incredible efforts on behalf of ending discrimination and advancing liberty and opportunity. Today, the Senate will vote to break the chains of discrimination that hold back millions of LGBT Americans from the full promise of liberty. Liberty, the freedom to participate fully in our society, from the public square to the voting booth, to the school, to the workplace. Liberty, that quality deeply rooted in our national journey and embedded in our Declaration of Independence. Quote, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Liberty, the declared mission of our nation in the preamble to the Constitution. Quote, we the people, in order to form a perfect union and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish the Constitution of the United States of America. But the march to liberty has been a long march with numerous battles along the way. The fight to end slavery that President Lincoln figured so prominently in. The fight to end racial discrimination. The fight to end gender discrimination. The fight to end discrimination against our seniors. And the fight that continues today with this bill to end discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Discrimination diminishes the potential of the individual, and it diminishes the potential of our nation. Senator Ted Kennedy said this succinctly when he helped introduce in 2009 a predecessor of the bill that we will be voting on today. Senator Ted Kennedy said, the promise of America will never be fulfilled as long as justice is denied to even one among us. He spoke these words just 20 days before he passed away. And it's appropriate to quote Ted Kennedy because he led the fight for this bill since its first introduction in 1994. And I think he would be tremendously pleased with the bipartisan vote of affirmation against discrimination that we'll soon be taking. Along the course of the 2 decades, many have helped. Many have helped on this bill whose footsteps no longer echo in these halls. And to all of those champions of liberty who have participated in this process, I say thank you. But there are many champions of liberty still in this body who have been fighting towards this moment, and I want to make sure that I acknowledge them. Senator Harkin, who championed many elements, including ending discrimination against those with disabilities, and who steered this bill through his committee. Senator Harry Reid and the leadership team, which worked together to enable this moment in the calendar to have this debate and to advocate for this bill. Senator Tammy Baldwin, who brought new energy from the House and the powerful voice of her personal experience to bear on this debate. Senator Collins, who just spoke, who's done so much for so long to make this happen. In the first 2 years, 2009 and 2010, the lead co-sponsor. And she passed the baton to Senator Kirk, who has carried that baton forward in a most admirable way. Senator Murkowski and Hatch joined in to help this bill come out of committee and help create the momentum. Senators Portman, Ayotte, Heller, Toomey, and Hatch engaged to help make sure that the religious exemption that we develop with the right hand is not taken away with the left hand, to reinforce the integrity of the Title VII religious exemption. Senator Flake, who brought forward ideas how to make sure that the guidance would be there to help businesses understand how to implement this act. There's a lot of coalition groups that have done a tremendous amount on this. Well done. Every conversation like this takes advocates inside a chamber and advocates outside a chamber, but a particular acknowledgement of the Human Rights Campaign. And there are 2 staff members on my team who have labored on this that I want to personally acknowledge. Scott Rosenthal, who carried this organizational responsibility for a number of years, and my legislative director. Thank you. I ask for 1 more minute.
Is there objection? Without objection.
So a big thanks to Scott Rosenthal and to my legislative director, Jeremiah Bauman, who provided over these last few months this critical final organizing stage. So I look forward to this vote for liberty, this vote for freedom, this vote for opportunity, this vote for a fair and just America. Thank you, Mr. President.
Under the previous order, all post-cloture time is yielded back, and the clerk will read the title of the bill for the 3rd time.
Calendar number 184, S815, a bill to prohibit employment discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity.
Under the previous order, the question occurs on passage of S815 as amended.
Ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? Appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Markowski. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reid of Rhode Island. Mr. Reid of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz.
Take care of it.
Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Ayotte, Baldwin, Begich, Bennett, Boxer, Brown, Carper, Collins, Coons, Donnelly, Feinstein, Flake, Hagan, Hatch, Heinrich, Heller, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Kirk, Leahy, Levin, Manchin, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murkowski, Murphy, Nelson, Portman, Reid of Rhode Island, Reid of Nevada, Toomey, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Cochran, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Hoeven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johnson of Wisconsin, Lee, McConnell, Moran, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Shelby, Vitter, Wicker. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johans, no. Mr. Corker. Mr. Corker, no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain, aye. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Markey, aye. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Franken, aye. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Cardin, Mr. Cardin. Aye. Cantwell, Ms. Cantwell. Aye. Ms. Hirono, Ms. Hirono. Aye. Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Whitehouse. Aye. Ms. Heitkamp, Ms. Heitkamp. Aye. Ms. Warren, Ms. Warren. Aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Harkin, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye.
Are there any senators wishing to vote or to change their vote? If not, on this vote, the ayes are 64, the nays are 32. The bill as amended is passed. Senator from Indiana. Senate will be in order. Senators, please take their conversations out of the chamber.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Indiana.
On Veterans Day, we come together to honor the brave men and women who have given so much to defend our country and protect our freedoms. I think of so many veterans. Thank you, Mr. President. On Veterans Day, we come together to honor the brave men and women who have given so much to defend our country and protect our freedoms. I think of so many veterans, including my dad, who served in the United States Navy. And I want to take this opportunity to say thank you to our country's veterans and the nearly 500,000 veterans in the state of Indiana for your service to the nation. Veterans Day is also a chance to reaffirm our country's commitment to caring for veterans and their families. While it's important to say thank you to veterans, it is even more important to express our gratitude through action for all generations of veterans. There are several ongoing efforts in my office that I would like to share with everyone. I have been a proud supporter of the Veterans History Project through the Library of Congress, and it has done an outstanding job in leading this effort. We have so much to learn from our veterans, and it's vital that we record their stories and experiences for future generations. I would like to urge veterans of any conflict to contact our office if you would like to share your story. We stand ready to give Hoosiers information on this important project, and please contact us at any time if you'd like to participate. Additionally, there are Hoosier veterans of Vietnam and other wars who still have not received or have lost over the years their honors or their medals that they earned for their heroism. Now is the time to resolve these cases. I am so deeply honored this Veterans Day to be handing to 4 Hoosier veterans, Mr. Michael Hodgson, Mr. Kennard Terhune, Mr. Jim Horn, and Mr. Julian Kornstrom, the many medals and ribbons that they were awarded for their service their bravery, and that they still have not received. I also believe it's important to honor veterans from all conflicts, which is why earlier this year I introduced a bill that would authorize the construction of a national Desert Storm and Desert Shield Memorial at no cost to the government. The men and women who fought in the first Gulf War, especially those who gave the ultimate sacrifice, deserve to have their service memorialized. Now, we have a new generation of veterans. They have returned home from Iraq and Afghanistan, and many of them are still coping with readjusting to civilian life. They have experienced health challenges, including traumatic brain injuries and post-traumatic stress disorder. These incredible challenges have resulted from their service and their dedication to our country. Our veterans have earned the best care that we can provide, and this includes access to timely and quality medical care. It is both our challenge and our priority to ensure a smooth transition and to effectively treat any health conditions linked to their service efforts. In particular, I am dedicated to addressing the problem of military and veteran suicide. If you are in need of or know of a service member or a veteran who has challenges and who is in need, please know that seeking help is a sign of strength, not a sign of weakness. And from that strength, there is always help that is available. I am also committed to addressing the backlog in benefits claims, one of the most significant challenges facing the Veterans Administration. Wait times for benefit claims are at an unacceptably high level. In the VA regional office in Indianapolis, Hoosiers play a critical role in processing claims to eliminate the backlog. I thank them for their public service, their hard work, and urge them to continue to do whatever they can to reduce that wait time so that benefits may be received more promptly. While I know the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, General Shinseki, is fully committed to solving this problem, more must be done. And I stand ready to work together with my colleagues to provide the VA the tools it needs to accomplish this goal, reduce the wait times, and take even better care of our veterans. In addition to ensuring care and benefits for our veterans, I believe economic opportunity is equally important. When I ask service members, what can we do for you? They always have the same answer. We just want to make sure there's a good job to come home to and a good job that can take care of our families when we do. A quality education and gainful employment gives our veterans the chance to fulfill the American dream, and it helps fulfill our responsibility in supporting our veterans. That's where all of us come in. As one of Indiana's United States Senators, I am always looking for ways to improve the transition from military to civilian life. Let's make sure our trade schools and universities welcome our veterans with open arms. To our business owners, thank you for all of the veterans you have hired, and I urge you to hire even more. Veterans have many skills that can translate to a variety of positions, and they have a strong commitment to quality and service, and you can always rely on our veterans. Hoosiers in every community, please welcome back our brave men and women, whether it's in your neighborhood, whether it's at the local restaurant, whether it's at your child's school, or whether it's at church on Sunday. On Veterans Day and every day, let us honor America's veterans by cherishing the freedoms they have defended. Our country is grateful for all you have done for all of us. You have given us our safety, our freedom, and our liberty. Thank you. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Arkansas.
President, I rise today to talk about an important initiative that I think is extremely important, not just to my state of Arkansas,